Presentation 8 is about techniques and by extension about technology and the relationship between the two. As such, it is part of the making of our three-part structure for Introduction to Design Studies. Because techniques, as much as material, which we covered in the previous presentation, mark a material basis for design. At the same time, as previously, I would like to keep with our overall theme of the visual narratives, and thus I will attempt to tell stories about techniques and by extension technology. The stories are inspired and relate to one of the key images for Introduction to Design Studies. You're all familiar with this image from the very first session, indeed from the electronic syllabus, namely the French street artist YZ, pronounced eyes, and her Amazon project, which she installed in West Africa, especially in Senegal, in 2015. How can we talk about technique in relationship to her work? How can we tell stories about this technique? How can we tell about the way in which she worked with material? In a previous iteration of Introduction to Design Studies, we talked about the materials that were accumulated next to the restaurant where her artwork is featured on. And we talked about the possible ways in which these materials have been used. So here, a technique of making comes into it. However, there is also a technique of representation, not just because Eyes is using visual narratives through the portraits of the Amazons, but also because a historical narrative, a story of the past, is brought to life and inserted into a social narrative, a story of the present, of the ownership of the restaurants, as we will find out in a moment. So, when considering representation, we must consider two things. One, the representation of the process. How did Eyes arrive at the works of design that she put onto the walls of the restaurants and cafes? And what was the genesis of the work itself? How is the process of making, the technique and the materials that are used articulated, and how is the visual contents, the actual meaning perhaps, or the symbolism of the work being told through a particular technique of representation? Here we have what could be considered a study for the live project that Eyes realized in Senegal, namely ink on paper drawings that were mounted on metal, some of wood, on wood, this one particularly on metal, preliminary to going to West Africa and working directly onto the material. As you can see, it is very much in keeping with the visual narrative of the Amazons. And when we talk about this visual narrative, we talk of different techniques. Techniques of engagement, historically, namely the Amazon fighting against colonialism. We're talking of techniques of representation, as mentioned before. How is the struggle? How is the emancipation? How is the historical rebellion and the conflict being articulated through the gaze of the people being portrayed, through the locations on where they are shown, etc. Finally, as also mentioned before, what is the material? What is the technique that Eyes use to process the material into her design work? Are there structural distinctions in terms of how we see these techniques? Let's begin with working the material. Eyes is a French street artist. She creates original artworks on paper to be featured on city walls. These short-lived images become part of the city environment and pose questions about the present and about fading memories. The different series she has created since 2011 are designed as narratives of female power across history and geographies. Eyes has produced images of 19th century women on French walls, but here she talks about a particular narrative that has to do with part of her heritage in West Africa and the way she wants to work within the environment that was generated by this narrative. With Eyes' project in West Africa, she wants to pay tribute to the Dahomey Amazons, an 18th and 19th century all-female military regiment that fought against the French in Dahomey, modern-day Benin, on the west coast of Africa, sandwiched between Togo and I forgot the other country. Eyes draws with ink on thinly layered woven paper, large scroll portraits that are based on historical images. She then pastes these images, these papers, onto the walls of female-owned businesses around Senegal, particularly on restaurants and breakfast stands with lots of foot traffic and in the view of everyday public. She uses a rather thin paper to allow the texture of the building surface to show through, so that the work is not confused with a poster perhaps, but as integral part of the material fabric of the environment, of the building they're depicted on, whether in this case it's corrugated metal shed, or a concrete wall, or a plaster wall of a restaurant. What technique of representation does she use? What technique of narration can be used to explain the background to images? Here's a quote from an article published in Bust magazine, a Brooklyn-based feminist magazine from 2017. Quote, known to each other as the non-miton, which means our mothers, the female warriors of Dahomey, a coastal West African kingdom that existed from roughly 1600 until 1904 of our common era, were one of the first professional female combat units ever. Renowned for their ferocity and imperviousness to pain, they fought to expand the borders of Dahomey and protect their homes from the enemies like the Yoruba. When visiting Europeans stumbled across the Dahomey in their tropical nation bordering the northernmost portions of the Atlantic Ocean in the Gulf of Guinea, the visitors were so stunned by the women's skill and strong physiques that they dubbed them Amazons, after the female warriors of Greek mythology. Such was the size of the female skeleton and the muscular development of the frame that in many cases femininity could be detected only by the bosom, wrote astonished British explorer Richard Burton upon arriving in Dahomey in 1863. We didn't need to comment here on the implied misogyny and colonialism of this white man's perspective. Nevertheless, the astonishment might also suggest a certain positive attitude to that, not just a patronizing one. But I leave this up to you. At the height of their power, Nometon were about 6,000 women strong and wielded 3-inch razors and muskets. Many were capable of decapitating their enemies with a single blow, and were known to bring the heads of their victims home, where they would boil the skin of the skulls and then display them as trophies. The Nometon were always prepared to fight to the death, and many did die. It's estimated that in the latter half of the 19th century, they may have lost as many as 15,000 women. Even so, they were considered astounding warriors, and the colonizing Europeans who faced them in the battle spoke of them with awestruck reverence. Their appearance is more martial than the generality of man, wrote British explorer John Duncan. And if undertaking a campaign, I should prefer the female soldiers to the male soldiers of this country. By the late 1870s, non-miton had been whittled down considerably to around 1,500 soldiers. Then in 1887 they became embroiled in an incident that would ultimately bring about their demise. Around this time, the Europeans were all fighting to snatch up one little slice of Africa, and there were strong French present near the Dahomey kingdom. One day, the Dahomey decided to attack a port town that was a French protectorate. The governor of the town, in a panic, waved the French flag in hopes that the non-Beton might understand he was untouchable. But that plan didn't work. A non-Beton lopped his head off, then wrapped it in the very flag he'd been waving. As a result, the French staged a full war on the Dahomey. The non-Beton, fierce as they were no match for France's modernized firepower. And in 1892, the French declared victory. The male soldiers of Dahomey fought the French alongside the non-Beton, but it was the women who were the last to surrender. And even then, they didn't go down quietly. According to the Smithsonian magazine, there was a rumor that the survivors took their revenge on the French by covertly substituting themselves for civilian Dahomey women who were taken into the Annemasse stockade. Each allowed herself to be seduced by a French officer, waited for him to fall asleep, and then cut his throat with his own bayonet. By the end of the Second Franco-Dahomean War, the French prevailed, but only after bringing in the Foreign Legion armed with machine guns. The last of the king's forces to surrender, most of the Amazons died in the 23 battles fought during the Second War. The legionnaires later wrote about the incredible courage and audacity of the Amazons. Only about 15 Nathaniel survived that war, and it's believed some of them sailed to America and enjoyed ethnographic showcases such as Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. Amazingly, the last known non-Beton died only in 1979. She was living in a village in Quinta in Benin, today's Benin, and she was estimated to be around 103. So much for the historical narrative, but of course there's a social narrative attached to it. This comes from a more academic source published in New York in 2011. Despite the brutal training they were to endure as the king's soldiers, for many women it was a chance to escape lives of forced domestic drudgery. Serving in the non-Beton offered women the opportunity to rise to positions of command and influence, taking prominent roles in the Grand Council, debating the policy of the kingdom. They could even become wealthy as single independent women, living in the king's compound, of course, but surrounded with supplies, tobacco and alcohol at their disposal. They held as slaves too. Stanley Alpern wrote, quote, "When Amazons walked out of the palace, they were preceded by a slave girl carrying a bell. The sound told every male to get out of their path, retire a certain distance, and look the other way." Here were the techniques of storytelling, of the dramatic conflict between the non-Beton and in Dahomey and the French colonial powers. How are these narratives of violent struggle represented in Ay's street art in the Senegal? Precisely, what techniques were used in designing and making the work? And how can we tell stories about these techniques that gel with the historical stories that we become familiar with? Let me turn to an idea of working the material. And from now on, our presentation will feature a visual narrative of hands. From all over the globe, doing all kinds of work, employing all kinds of techniques. And I would like to return to Gottfried Semper, the Dresden-born architect, whom I talked about when looking at methodologies. And I introduced him both in the context of materialism and the idea of freeing design from ethnographic and linear histories, and bringing him into a context where design is representing a universal will to create. Ideas that are shared across geographies, across time, across places, across people, and not confined to hegemonies of culture, for example, in the industrialized West. Gottfried Semper wrote in his famous book Style, or the Technical and Tectonic Arts, that he published in 1860 and 1863 in 2 volumes, quote, "Why textiles are treated first?" And I mentioned this idea of weaving, of working with the hands to combine strands of straw or twigs or threads or woolen fibers. And I quoted this when talking about methodology as the principal craft and the principal technical activity that underpins a lot of design work for Semper. And here, in this book of 1860, he gives us the idea of why he's treating weaving of textiles as a fundamental thing. Quote, "It is hard to establish which of the technical branches listed in the previous chapter was practiced first in the natural course of human development. And ultimately, there's little point in knowing this. But there can be no doubt that in the first 2 branches, textiles and ceramics, we find the first efforts to embellish functional objects through a conscious choice of form and decoration, which one could say is the essence of design. Of these two arts, textiles should undoubtedly take precedence, because they can be seen, as it were, as the primeval art from which all other arts, not excepting ceramics, borrowed their types and symbols, whereas in itself was quite independent in this respect. Textile types evolved within the art itself, or were borrowed directly from nature. So there's something germane within textile weaving, or weaving in general, that is not copying from other forms of practice, other techniques. There can be no doubt that the first principle of style are bound up with these earliest of artistic techniques. So here Semper very early brings a relationship between styles and techniques. Paragraph 5 says, basic objectives of this technique of weaving. The idea of a system of material units, bringing together 2 things in a material unit, whose attributes are pliability, suppleness, and toughness, came about for the following reasons. 1, to string and to bind. 2, to cover, to protect, and to enclose. So here you could say you have a very constructive principle, and you have a principle that applies to all forms of textile work and fashion, namely to cover, to protect, and to close. And by extension, you already have a material function in the first and a social function implied in the second. Semper continues, all forms arising from these purposes approximate either a linear or a planimetric form. Linear forms are better suited to stringing and binding, or to representing the idea symbolically, line drawings. Planimetric forms are necessary up to cover, protect, and enclose. Planimetric meaning horizontal fabrics, covers, the extension of threads and woven fibers to create larger areas that are bound together through a weaving technique and can thus be used for clothing, for covering a wall, for producing shelter in a ceiling, and so on and so forth. So the planometrics will also become self-evident symbols of the concept of protecting, covering, and enclosing in art. See, for example, clothing in the idea of textiles providing at the same time a cover against the element, but distinguishing the wearer through this cover. Not just as somebody who's protected, but as somebody who assumes a particular position, a particular identity through the decorative cover. So you can see that Semper is interested in textiles because it expands so quickly from a principal material base, which, as he says, is primordial to many, many different techniques, to a wider social and cultural and perhaps even political meaning. So when does a fundamental human activity of making, as in Semper's case of weaving, become defined as a technique? Here are a few considerations. Experiencing work with hands, tools, machines, services leads to more or less systematized actions and procedure. There is an idea of a heuristic technique, learning by doing, learning that involves practice. So maybe making becomes a technique when you start to systematize it, when you're trying to define it, to describe it, and then to communicate it and to train others in that technique, passing skill from one practitioner to the next. Then, when the technique has been honed and is seen as successful and productive, you document the practice as a system of teaching and learning. But of course there are challenges, even to a well-established techniques. So maybe there's a systematic development of a technique, or there's free experimentation with an existing technique. So these might be internal to the technique, you use the same materials, you use the same established traditions of making something, but they could also come from outside, that you bring in a different technique to weaving. For example, the bonding of fabrics is added to weaving to maybe produce waterproof protections. Technique, of course, because it often involves a set of tools. You also have to generate these tools and learn how to define them and how to use them for these specific material applications that you're trying to exercise in technique. Then, of course, in a cultural setting, in a social setting, in a political setting, and in economic settings, you start codifying the practice. You establish a craft tradition or an artisanal training, and you build it into a tradition, and you commercialize it as particular to a site of origin or a particular people, where it then becomes connected to the local availability of materials, energy supplies, and facilities. Which doesn't mean that, of course, any technique that's worth its salt doesn't need to use only local things. On the contrary, if it brings in elements from outside, it might even be more precious and even more valued, because it accommodates things that are imported into a locale or a culture. Then eventually, when you start thinking about techniques, maybe as in design studies, you start to reflect on them, and you reflect on the practitioners. Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? Why did it come about? Why is it prevalent in certain cultures? Why has it waned in others where it's no longer practiced? So techniques can become self-reflexive and being indicative of human character, and you start thinking about what this means to you as a maker, or when you see it, to you as a spectator or a user of a product, a system, a service that has been generated by a particular technique. So, these considerations, how do they allow us to consider technique within the design process? Should we now start talking about technology rather than technique when we are looking at modern design? Let's look at the definition of technology, and then we can see what the relationship is between the previous contemplation of techniques and the present understanding of technology. What are the relationships and how do they work, especially in design? So here I offer you a few ideas about the definition of technology. Technology can be defined as the sum of the methods by which a social group provides itself with material objects of the civilization. Technology is the human process of applying resources to satisfy our wants and needs and to expand our capabilities. It is the totality of means employed to provide objects necessary for human sustenance and comfort. Totality, the bringing together of many things, define technology. So it's a synthetic idea. Technology is a discipline by which humans utilize their scientific knowledge to change or manipulate the physical world, to create tools and to create tools to enable them to do so. So here the idea of the rational, of the scientific, the idea of tools to understand the world, to literally comprehend it in a tactile relationship that then allows you to maybe change organic material like straw or twigs or fibers that were grown and spun into artificial products that both represent the material that we find in our organic surroundings and symbolically or visually can feature patterns or visuals that in turn also reflect back on nature or on the maker or on the consumer of these things. So the organic into the artifact is also something that can be done by techniques and by extension by technology. Technology is also the application of practical science to industry and commerce, a very modern meaning. Technology is the method, theory, or practice governing such application. For example, a highly developed technology, we then speak of a system of thought. The total knowledge and skills available to any human society for industry, art, and science. Continuing with this idea of the synthetic, the accumulation of ideas within one term, namely technology. Technology is also an externalization of the imagination that can or does augment, amplify, and extend the human. Here we come back to an idea that one of our students formulated very much at the beginning of Introduction to Design Studies. I think it was even in the very first lesson, where design was very aptly and very nicely described as an original representation of reality. And indeed, an original representation, an original interpretation of reality. And that's exactly what it is. It is trying to externalize what we imagine through a technique, through the use of materials, that design achieves these representations that we hold so dear. Or sometimes we criticize them, but they reflect what our imagination brings forth. And they do so, I reiterate this, in an everyday environment, not in the elite environment of art, but in an everyday culture, where we have to deal with this representation, realization of our imagination or somebody else's imagination on a daily basis. We are confronted with it always. Here comes a definition of technology that is sociological and highly critical of its role in human societies. It comes from an American sociologist called Klaus Krippendorf. And it comes from a very odd book on contents analysis, which is very sociological about forms in which people live together. But within that, there's a short meditation of technology that I found quite interesting, and I would like to read it to you. Quote, "Technology is the body of knowledge about and the systemic study of methods, techniques, and hardware applied in the adaptation of the physical environment to man's needs and wants. The application of scientific knowledge to build or improve the infrastructure of agriculture, industry, government, and daily life. Technology must not be confused with the very infrastructure it generates. Technology has autocatalytic properties. That means they are catalysts, things that generate a reaction by one of its products. So technology reflects on itself and uses its own products to propose solutions." Krippendorf precisely says, quote, "It favors the use of technical devices and processes even in solving social problems. For example, by using fertilizers to enhance agricultural production rather than a different form of work organization. By using computers for national planning rather than decentralized decision-making processes." So technology becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you use technology, you get used to the techniques that it puts forward to such an extent that you don't think of systemic changes. You think if a problem occurs within technology, only technology can solve this. And you know all of this from the present occupation with climate change, where climate change and the effect that we will feel now and feel in the next decades are approached through technology to be solved. Although this technology we're using in trying to solve climate change is the very technology that puts us into this perilous state in the first place, namely industrial technologies that generate material waste, generate emissions, and raid our planet of resources. So instead of saying we consume less and we change our behavior, we are looking towards technology to solve our problems. Carbon capturing, injecting the atmosphere with things that can repair the ozone layer, instead of saying no, technology is one of the prime movers that generate the problem in the first place. So we have to step back. This is what Krippendorf means by autocatalytic. And this is the danger, that when we surmise techniques in a definition of technology, we are faced with. Namely, that technology becomes an overarching occupation of human society. And this goes back to the ancient Greece. This idea of technology as a positivist force that codifies and generates wealth and determines our social being. In Greek, the word techne makes up one part of technology, while logos makes up the others. So we have the idea of craft and art combined with the systematic study. You can see this ology, as in geology, sociology, and so on and so forth. So technology being the systematic study and application of a craft or art. Techne is a Greek word for knowing how to make or do, thus not synonymous with technique, as in making or doing something, but pertaining to the order of being. So slightly advanced. So here I'm not talking about the synthetic meaning of technology, but something that goes beyond the use and meaning of technique. It's not just collecting different techniques under an umbrella term as technology, but technology becomes a different way of considering things, a different way of knowing. So while a technique could be synonymous with making something, a technology could be synonymous with knowing and communicating how to make something, how to cure, how to measure, how to write. Technology is positioned opposite physis, or techne rather, is positioned opposite physis by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher of the classical period, and stands in conflict with the older nous, the wisdom that is delivered by the gods to woman or man. And what Aristotle and other Greek philosophers of the classical period, most notably Plato, do by this is saying that techne appears as a self-conscious knowledge of woman or man derived from experience, learning and developed as a technique rather than a gift of wisdom that is imparted on her or him by a deity. So it's not something preordained or organic that arises in you, but something that you really have to study and practice through the use of tools and so on and so forth, and to pass it on through apprenticeships or traditions of learning. So it is self-generated, and through the self-generated maybe offers an option of self-determining for the maker and the user. In this form then, derived from techne, technique can be seen as a form of knowledge that is employed to solve practical problems, and therefore appears as a component of technology. So by defining techne as something that pertains as a root of the word both to technique and technology, and by moving technique into the realm of making and doing in a particular way, and moving technology into a different area where it stands as an umbrella term over many techniques, but at the same time represents a particular form of knowing, namely how to make something. The word technique, then, in this relationship to the wider term technology, can be made more concrete by thinking about techniques as something that solves practical problems, as a particular piece of knowledge that is part of technology. Not subservient to technology, but as a particular constituent, as something that is at the basis of a technology. Technique is purposeful, pragmatic, and a means by which we can achieve a certain end. For example, to learn a technique is how to throw a pot or blow glass or paint a watercolor. And maybe a number of techniques are required in combination to create a basis for technology. So, defining technique and technology, not necessarily as opposing forces, but as things where one term, technology, might contain the other one, technique, as an accumulative synthetic idea, but technique also defining itself as something very particular. We establish a kind of relationship between the importance of knowing something, of being able to practice something, and to solve problems through the expertise of a craft, of skill, of a way of doing something, and the wider understanding of the social forces of these techniques that can be surmised in the technology, and talk to you about how we understand our world, how we understand how we make things, and how the understanding of how we make things gives rise to particular forms of perception and knowing. So we come back to this idea at the very beginning that in the project by Eyes, we are confronted with a technique of storytelling that then requires a technique of representation. So you wouldn't bring those techniques together to form a technology, but the one technique contrasts the other, and they work together as very distinct forces. So this tells us that technique is something separate from technology, although it might be ranged beneath it in terms of cognition, in terms of understanding things. Putting technology in a higher position means perhaps fetishizing this. And this goes back to Krippendorf's critique. The critique of saying that it is autocatalytic. It pretends that it can solve its own problems. And this has led, especially in Western industrialization, to a techno evolution that is beholden to an idea of progress that is often quantifiable rather than qualifiable. So there's the idea of technological determinism that Krippendorf talks about, that we get so beholden to technology that any problems we face, we try and address through the means of technology, not necessarily through changing our consciousness or changing our social system or changing our economic system of exchange, but we look to the material progress that seems to be generated by technology for the solutions of the peril and the drama that we put ourselves into as a human society, as a global society. So, associated with technological determinism, this idea that technology is almost an inescapable move forward, is the idea of Techno Evolutionism. We evolve through technology, and here the hand obviously is the hand of the robot and the data glove. This involves a linear evolutionary view of universal social change through the fixed sequence of different technological stages. You all know this, you heard in school about the invention of fire, the invention of wheels, and so on and so forth. The idea in America, for example, of Henry Ford generating a chain gang system, the idea of making gunpowder in China, the idea of book printing in China, the idea of particular agricultural techniques in West Africa, all of these things drive our history of human civilization. And of course, rightly so, but it should not exclusively so. Because of course, societies also progress through understanding each other. So cooperation, community building, social change, not just technological change. However, unfortunately, in the economic system that we live in now, it seems, certainly in retrospect, that technology has very much moved our history. And this is what Krippendorf and others criticize as evolutionary or Techno Evolutionism, as an evolutionary lineage to technology. It is a kind of development or historical determinism. We can't escape it, you know. One movement, one technological invention begets the next, or is contrasted or bettered by the next. Evolutionary theorists interpret change in terms of progress, an improved state of affairs, often financial gain, and usually regard progress as inevitable. Techno-evolutionary theorists define progress in terms of successive stages of technological development, frequently portrayed as technological revolutions. You heard about this myth of the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe in the 18th century. So the age of machinery, the age of automation, the atomic age, the space age, the electronic age. We love to use these terms because they allow us to measure progress in very simple, quantifiable terms, rather than in more challenging, qualifiable terms as to human happiness, fulfillment, mindfulness, and so on and so forth. So, technological determinism poses us certain problems. Not all of these problems can be solved by design, but some of them give rise to design solutions, or at least design thinking. So, here's a list of some of the problems of technological determinism. There's a focus on causality. This technique generates this result of this material. You know, it seems like an inevitable process that one thing leads to another. It's reductionist. Technology is reduced to tools and machines. It's not the original techniques that Semper is talking about. It's very much dependent on certain things that we have at our disposal. Think of certain software programs or certain materials that are available while others not. So it determines design processes, thinking processes, by being beholden to tools and machines and materials rather than ideas or communicative structures. It's technocentric. It's a social focus on techniques, on technology. It's mechanistic understanding of human history and evolution. It's allied to the history or the philosophy of positivism, i.e. a constant progress of human mankind, measured purely economically through growth rather than happiness, as I said before. There's a technical constituent to society. We become technocratic. So Aristotle already warned that technique can become politeia. So a certain way of doing can give rise to a certain social organization. And if we are dependent on technology, we become a technocratic society. We think that whatever Silicon Valley does for us generates not just wealth for the US, for example, but also betters mankind by having certain software systems available, by having certain electronic devices, by having self-driving cars and so on and so forth, without actually giving pause to an idea of designing alternative means of communicating, of structuring a society. So a technical constitution of society might not necessarily be an unproblematic thing. It reifies things, it solidifies emotions, social connections into objects, systems, and services. And it universalizes, but not in the Semper way that seemed very democratic, of saying the idea of design can come from different societies, geographies, at different places, at different times. But it universalizes in that it globalizes particular techniques that they seem to use. And again, I can come back to Silicon Valley and say, well, if there's a certain software that we're all using, to a certain extent, which I'm using to give you this presentation, that generates a particular form of expression, a particular design to this very presentation, because I'm using a particular software. So technology, especially if it's widespread, can homogenize, can level things up, can forbid experimentation or originality. So let me offer a visual narrative of a technique. And I would ask you to please click on the hyperlink here and look at Enzo Mari's demonstration of how to assemble your chair. This is one of his projects that he initiated very early on in his career in 1974. Enzo Mari is perhaps one of the most socially conscious and revolutionary designers in the second half of the 20th century. He's largely unknown because he doesn't produce commodities, he doesn't produce things that can be bought and sold. He does produce some design works, but he more, maybe in the vein of Victor Papanek, produces ideas and concepts for design. And in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, so at a similar time to Victor Papanek, this Italian designer, trained as a product designer, industrial designer, but also keenly interested in politics, economics, and sociology, generated a project of autoprogezione, the idea that you make things yourself, you generate things for yourself, and through learning a technique, making something, you experience the idea of knowledge formation. You can become your own designer, and although your product might not be particularly advanced in a kind of elitist or particularly elaborate technique that you might have to employ, but rather in the way in which you take ownership, in which you integrate design into your everyday life. And then Samari produced for children, for people with learning difficulties, for older people. And here you can see him demonstrating at the age of 80 how to use his ideas. He produced works that were universal in the way in which they could be exercised by many people, and each individual could choose what to learn from it in a very particular way, in a very particular situation. But being a creative designer, he also wanted to give ideas, and he wanted to give some creative direction. Thus, he produced a set to make a stool, a very simple chair that you can assemble from wood. And here in this video from 2011, you see him at a ripe old age demonstrate of how easy it is to put his self-design into practice. So enjoy this video, and then please come back to this presentation. Another visual narrative of a technique I would like to offer by staying within the same design field, namely chair design. And I'm offering you here a detail of work that was done by two craftsmen, designer, artisans from Ghana, Bibi Sek and Aye Irise, who made a hand-woven sofa and bench for the Italian company Moroso in 2009, entitled Madame Dakar. A traditional technique. And as I said, this contrast might just be a cliched narrative and not as substantial as the company and the designers had hoped for. But riffing on the idea of Gottfried Semper's celebration of weaving as the basic human facility, as something that gives rise to many, many different forms of design, I wanted to offer this as an example of techniques that come together through contrasts. And although they certainly don't speak of technology as such, although the tubular steel might be allocated to technological progression, that they are able to do these things in a relatively economic way now in 2009. But it certainly speaks of contrasting techniques as individual forms of making that can come together and through their contrast generate what I would consider a very interesting piece of design. I want to end with some concluding questions. Do we need to regard techniques and technology in general as a social or cultural construct, and not as the autonomous ability to address material challenges, as, for example, the universalizing ideas of Semper had postulated? So are techniques, unlike what Semper thought, this universal will to create, will to art, are they actually social and cultural constructs because they have to be formulated and taught and communicated? Or are techniques something germane to every human being? Do techniques have a utilitarian imprint, i.e., are they to be useful or rational? And have they got to be learned and trained? And if so, what about notions of play, of experimentation, of curiosity as factors in making? Are there techniques that involve happy accidents? Or is there a willful subversion or a malfunction, a misuse of a machine as much part of technology as the smooth functioning? So do techniques allow us to subvert and challenge and experiment? The answer might be obvious, but then the question is, how do you define those techniques? Furthermore, is there a form of technological enthusiasm? Might technical inventions in this case, serve little purpose at first, and experiments have their own rationale, instead of the all too readily purporting to solve problems, facilitate processes, and generate economic growth? This question might go back to something that we talked about before, namely, design doesn't have to be problem solving. Design is a fundamental human activity that leads to a better condition. Think of what P.J. Gore did in his racialized design presentation, where he talked about changing situations to the better as one of the main purposes of design. Are techniques limited to use hardware, tools, or become represented in the material object? Or can we see techniques as social processes and cultural phenomena? So they might not be rooted in the material. As with much service and system design, we can think of certain techniques to change society, as in the example of Eyes Amazon, a technique of fighting colonialism by instilling the idea of combat in a part of the people that might not have been readily expected by the colonizer. So is a technique of subversion, i.e. having a female combat unit, although it was traditionally instigated by the king of the Dahomey, did it actually fulfill its purpose because the European invader and colonialists were not used to the technique of female fighters and the way in which they conducted themselves, and thus didn't have an answer at first. So is technique not bound to the material object, but to systems and social and cultural forces? What about tradition and learning as integral part of the history of techniques? For example, when it's codified in apprenticeships and guild structures, as in much of Europe, but also parts of Asia, where technique is traditionally taught by masters to apprentices or pupils. What does that mean? both about the social system behind technique, but also in the way in which we learn and practice them. And again, how does it relate to the potential of techniques to subvert and to experiment? So I want to leave you with these questions, and we will go into recitation classes where these questions will be used to start a discussion in conjunction with the reading that we have set aside for this session. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this new form of presentation as a recorded capsule with all its flaws, and I wish you a happy learning experience. Many thanks. Goodbye.